Tonight, my friends, I want to tell you the kind of story whispered not in joy, but in duty. It begins in silence and ends where love was never meant to bloom. Picture a small village nestled between two hills, where the wind always seemed to carry secrets from one side to the other. The year was 1194, and in the farthest corner of a stone-walled estate lived a girl named Elenor. She wasn't royalty, she wasn't famous. She was simply a daughter, and that, in her world, meant everything and nothing at once. Her father owned the southern fields, and her life had been quiet, filled with spinning wool, feeding hens, and watching the seasons paint the valley. But just beyond the river, past a thick forest and a ridge of jagged stones, there was another estate and another family who had hated hers for 3 generations. No one remembered how it started, only that blood had been spilled long ago, and the soil still carried the memory. So when peace was needed, it wasn't drawn by pen, or sealed with wine. It was arranged in silence, around a heavy table, where men spoke softly, and daughters didn't speak at all. Elenor was promised before she had her first kiss. The decision came folded inside a conversation she never heard. A day before her 15th birthday, her father entered the cottage with a long face and shorter words. Her mother wept that night, but quietly. The next morning, Elenor was told to prepare her things. She was to be sent north to the home of a man she'd never met, to marry a boy from the enemy's bloodline. For the good of the valley, they told her, so our sons won't die with swords in their hands. Elenor nodded, because what else could she do? Girls didn't get to argue with the sky. They only prayed the weather would be kind. The journey to her new home began before sunrise. Elenor wore a dress she hadn't chosen and sat in a wooden cart between bundles of fabric and dried herbs gifts from her family to the groom's household. The air smelled of damp hay and smoke. Her fingers clutched the edge of the bench, and though her lips didn't tremble, her heart did. Behind her, the village grew smaller, its rooftops swallowed by morning mist. She didn't turn back. Looking back wouldn't change anything, and besides, she already knew what goodbye felt like. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the way her mother pressed a piece of lavender into her palm without speaking. It was the way her father couldn't meet her eyes. The cart creaked as it rolled forward, pulled by a horse that didn't know it was part of a story people would one day forget. On either side of the road, trees swayed gently, as if whispering warnings they were too old to shout up behind midday. The hills flattened, and the land became sharper. Stone walls replaced hedges. The people they passed wore different colors. Even, the air seemed more cautious. Elenor had never crossed this far into the northern lands. Everything felt like it belonged to someone else, and soon she would too. The castle, when it appeared, didn't look cruel or grand. It was sturdy, square, and surrounded by tall grass that swayed like an audience holding its breath. A woman met her at the gate, not the groom's mother, but a servant dressed in grey wool, with hands that had known cold and duty for many years. Elenor was taken inside, her things quietly unpacked by others. No introductions, no ceremony, just the soft clatter of her future settling into place. She sat on the edge of the bed in a stone room lit by a single candle, and for a moment she wondered if peace ever truly felt peaceful, or if it always arrived wearing a stranger's name. That first night, Elenor didn't cry, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she didn't know where fear ended and duty began. The room was cold, though a small fire burned in the hearth. Its light danced on the stone walls, casting long shadows that looked like tall men standing in silence. She touched the embroidered edge of the blanket, tracing its patterns the way one reads a language they've never spoken. Across the hall, in a different room, lived the boy she was to marry, though she still hadn't seen his face. His name was Tristan, the youngest son of a family raised on war and tradition. Rumors said he was kind, others said he was distant. Elenor didn't care which was true. Kindness was not a promise, it was a coin flipped by fate, and she had no hand to catch it. In that silence, she imagined her mother lighting a candle at home, whispering a prayer for her daughter's first night in another life, and perhaps, just perhaps, hoping she would learn how to disappear into it gently, outside the narrow window. The wind howled like an old song no one remembered the words to. Elenor lay down fully dressed, unsure if this was her bed now, or merely a resting place between who she was and who she would be forced to become. The servants hadn't spoken much. They didn't need to. Their silence was louder than words, shaped by centuries of women arriving and folding into roles they didn't choose. Somewhere in the hall, a door creaked. Footsteps approached, slow and measured. She sat up, heart tight in her chest. Not from fear, but from the understanding that her life was no longer her own. But the footsteps passed. They belonged to someone else that night. Elenor lay back down, exhaled into the firelight, and closed her eyes. It was not sleep that came for her, but surrender. And in that moment, she finally understood why peace was sometimes quieter than love, because peace, unlike love, asks nothing back. The next morning, light entered Eleanor's room without asking permission. It spilled through the narrow window like a soft command, not gentle, but not cruel either, just certain. She sat up slowly, her hair undone, the warmth from the fire now just ashes and memory. A quiet knock echoed against the door, and before she could answer, it opened. The same servant woman stepped in, carrying a folded dress and a small bowl of water. "They're expecting you," she said, without meeting Eleanor's eyes. No explanation, no question. Elenor nodded and rose, her body moving as if borrowed. The dress was heavier than what she usually wore, deep blue with golden embroidery. That spoke of names she didn't yet know. She washed her face, braided her hair, and followed the servant down a hallway lined with old portraits. Faces looked down at her from wooden frames, noble, pale, unmoved, as if judging not who she was, but why she was there. And for the first time, Elenor realized she wasn't just marrying a boy. She was marrying a history. The dining hall was larger than she imagined. Long wooden tables stretched towards stained glass windows, where colored light danced across the stone floor. At the far end sat the boy Tristan alongside his father and mother. He looked up as she entered. His eyes were green, like the moss on old stone, and though he didn't smile, he didn't frown either. He stood, offered a small bow, and gestured for her to sit beside him. The air between them felt formal, like a dance rehearsed by strangers. His voice, when it finally came, was soft but deliberate. "I hope the room was warm enough," he said, as if warmth was something a stone castle could truly offer. Elenor nodded, unsure if she should say more. Around them, servants moved in silence, pouring wine, laying bread. The table was full, but the silence between them felt louder than the clatter of plates. It wasn't love, it wasn't hate. It was something in between, something arranged, like furniture in a room no one dared to change. The days that followed passed like pages, written in the same hand. Each morning, Elenor was awakened before the sun had fully climbed the hills, dressed in silks and laces she hadn't chosen, and led through halls that still felt borrowed. Meals were eaten in quiet, with words carefully measured and eyes that wandered but rarely met. Tristan was polite, never cruel, never cold but distant, as if he, too, were playing a role handed to him rather than lived from within. He asked her about her favorite flower once, and she told him about the wild irises that bloomed near the southern creek. He nodded, and nothing more was said. She couldn't tell if he didn't care or didn't know how to. There were no shared secrets between them, no accidental laughter, no moments where time softened. They were young, but the space between them aged everything. In the evenings, Elenor would walk the gardens alone. The path wound past hedges cut into shapes, fountains that no longer ran, and marble statues with eyes that never blinked. She found herself drawn to a bench near the old well, where vines had claimed the stone and birds nested overhead. It became her place, the only one that didn't ask anything of her. From there, she could see the edges of the horizon, where the forest thickened and the sky turned silver just before dusk. Sometimes she would whisper to the trees. Not words, just breath, just proof that she was still something more than a name on parchment. At night, back in her room, she'd stare at the ceiling and wonder what it would have felt like to fall in love without duty as the reason. But love was never the point of her story. Her marriage had ended a feud, not started a romance. Peace had its price, and that price was her silence. And so she remained still, like the castle, beautiful in the light, heavy in the dark, and never quite allowed to fall apart. One evening, just as twilight began to stretch its blue fingers across the sky, Elenor heard music drifting from the great hall. It was faint, the sound of a lute, maybe two, and a voice humming a tune without words. Curious, and drawn more by instinct than purpose, she followed the sound through the corridor until she reached the open door. Inside, a small gathering had formed. No formal occasion, just a handful of people seated near the fire. Tristan sat among them, not as a noble, but simply as a boy listening. He didn't notice her at first. She stood in the shadow of the doorway, hesitant to enter a moment that wasn't hers. The music continued, soft, gentle, like water flowing over stones. For the first time since arriving, Elenor saw something in Tristan's expression she hadn't seen before. Stillness. a kind of peace that didn't need words or permission. And for a moment, she felt like she was watching someone who might have existed long before the marriage vows, someone not yet shaped by obligation. She stepped back quietly, not wanting to interrupt the small freedom he had found. That night, she didn't return to her room right away. Instead, she wandered the lower corridors, where tapestries hung heavy with old dust and stories sewn by hands now long gone. One showed a wedding, two families shaking hands over a shared table. Another, a battlefield. Another still, a single dove flying between towers. Elenor touched the threads and wondered if the women who had stitched them ever imagined their work would become a kind of silent scripture telling girls like her what life would be. She wasn't unhappy, not exactly, but she wasn't whole either. She existed in between a name spoken politely, a face remembered for keeping the peace, and somewhere deep inside her, a quiet hope lingered that even a story written by others might one day take a turn no one expected. But until then, she would sit with the music in her memory and the silence in her chest, both soft, both steady, both hers. Weeks passed, and though the days carried the same routine, something small began to shift. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even visible, really. But Elenor felt it in the way her footsteps no longer echoed quite as sharply through the stone corridors, in the way a servant would glance up and nod before continuing her work, and most of all, in the way Tristan began to notice her presence, not just as a wife arranged by treaty, but as someone who existed outside of parchment and signature. One morning, as she sat in the garden near the well, he approached without a word. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. He simply placed a single wild iris beside her and walked away. It was the same flower she had mentioned once and assumed he had forgotten. It was a small gesture, but it was also the first one that belonged to them alone, not to their families, their lands, or their peace agreement. For the first time, Elenor smiled without needing permission. That evening, they shared a meal alone. The long table that once felt like a chasm between strangers now held warm bread, sweet pears, and two voices learning how to meet. Tristan spoke of the woods beyond the castle, of a fox he had once followed for hours as a boy. Elenor told him about her sister's singing voice, how it could quiet even their restless goats. They laughed softly, carefully, as if afraid the sound might crack the walls, and maybe it did, just a little. Later, by candlelight, he asked her if she liked music. Yes, she said, but only the kind you don't need to sing to. Understand? He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. No more was said. But that night, she found herself humming as she fell asleep, the first note of a song not written by duty. The wind outside still howled, but it no longer sounded like loneliness. It sounded like something waking up. The castle, once a backdrop of stone and silence, began to breathe differently around them, as if the walls, too, had waited for a reason to soften. Elenor noticed the change in small, quiet ways. The guards at the entrance greeted her with a nod rather than indifference. The cook started placing her favorite berries on the morning tray, without being asked, and even the birds seemed to linger longer at her window, chirping before flying off into the hills. There was no groan shift, no declaration of affection or rebellion, but something unnamed began to take root, a fragile, almost invisible thread of understanding between her and the life she had been placed into. Tristan never became someone else. He didn't transform into a romantic or poet, but he listened now. When she spoke of her old home, of the river where she and her sister used to wash laundry and sing songs of Keith, he didn't change the subject. He let her speak, and sometimes, when the fire had burned low and the hall had emptied, he would share a memory to quiet, guarded, but real. One evening, they rode out together, just the two of them. No guards, no servants, only the setting sun and the crunch of earth beneath the hooves of their horses. It wasn't a planned event, just a decision made with shared glances and silent agreement. They didn't race, they didn't speak much, but they rode side by side, past the vineyards, past the orchard, into a clearing where the world felt untouched by name or duty. There, they dismounted and sat beneath a willow tree whose branches draped around them like a curtain. For a long time, they said nothing. Then Tristan turned to her and asked, "Do you ever wish it had been different?" Elenor looked at him, really looked, and said softly, "I used to. But now, I only wish to be seen." He didn't promise anything. He didn't reach for her hand, but he nodded once, and in that gesture, something old between them finally exhaled. The willow tree became their secret place, a place beyond politics, beyond expectation, beyond the weight of names that weren't fully theirs. They returned there whenever the days inside the stone walls felt too heavy or too scripted, and there they let themselves speak not as a husband and wife by arrangement, but as two young souls who had been caught in the current of something, much older than themselves. Sometimes Elenor would read to him from a book of fables she had brought from home, stories about foxes that outsmarted kings and girls who danced with the wind. Tristan would listen in silence, eyes closed, as if letting the stories rewrite something inside him. Other times, they would simply lie back in the grass and trace the shapes of clouds with their fingers, guessing what each one looked like and laughing quietly when they disagreed. They never said it aloud, but both of them knew this place. These moments were the parts of their life they would carry, long after titles had changed or memories had faded. Yet even peace, once planted, is not always left untouched. One morning, a letter arrived bearing the seal of Tristan's family crest. A summons, a request, a reminder. His presence was needed at court, something about border negotiations and new alliances. He would be gone for weeks, perhaps longer. Elenor read the letter over his shoulder and felt something cold slip into her chest. Not fear, not anger, but something close to absence before it had even begun. "You will come back?" she asked, not looking at him. He didn't answer. "Right away." Then, in the quietest voice he'd ever used, he said, "I'll try." That night, they didn't speak much. They sat by the fire, sharing the same blanket, her head against his shoulder. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of things not yet said, of feelings not yet named, of hopes too soft to carry on paper. She fell asleep there, beside him, knowing that in the morning, the road would take him. But for now, the flame still burned, and the willow still waited. The morning Tristan left, the sky wore the color of unfinished thoughts, not quite grey, not quite blue, as if it, too, were unsure about the hours to come. Elenor stood by the gate, her hands folded in front of her, watching as the horses were prepared. He didn't dress like a prince that day. No silver, no crest, just a deep green cloak and leather gloves worn smooth by time. She memorized everything: the way his breath hung in the air, the shape of his boots in the dirt, the small fold near his left shoulder that never stayed flat. He approached her with slow steps, as though each one might undo his decision. No one else spoke. The castle held its breath. When he reached her, he offered no promises, only his eyes, searching hers, full of a weight that had never found words. "Willow tree," she whispered, too soft for anyone else to hear. He nodded. That was all. Then he mounted the horse, turned toward the path that curved into the forest, and disappeared beyond the bend where morning and memory blurred dot in the silence that followed. Elenor stood very still. The guards dispersed, the stable hands resumed their chatter, and the sound of hooves faded into nothingness. But she didn't move. Not yet. Something inside her needed to stay there, grounded, until she could gather the pieces that had scattered. With his leaving, finally, she turned and walked back through the castle halls. Each corridor felt longer now, each stone colder. She passed tapestries she'd once admired, their threads duller somehow in the absence of shared glances. In her chambers, she sat by the window, looking out over the orchard trees. A storm was building, but it hadn't reached her yet. Instead, she watched a single leaf fall spiraling gently, as if unsure whether to descend or return skyward. That day passed slowly. She didn't weep, she didn't speak. She simply waited, like the willow tree they both loved, bending with the wind, but never breaking, holding something sacred in its silence. As the days turned into weeks, Elenor fell into a rhythm of solitude that felt both protective and lonely. She woke with the light, walked the garden paths alone, and spent long afternoons in the quiet corner of the library where no one thought to look for her. The staff, sensing the hush that had settled around her, moved gently through the castle, careful not to disturb what they didn't fully understand. She received no letters, no word from Tristan, no sign that the world beyond the hills even remembered the girl who had been promised in peace. Still, she waited not just for his return, but for something else she couldn't name. In the silence, she began to see the castle differently, the way the sun hit the stone at dusk, turning grey into gold, the hidden ivy behind the eastern tower that bloomed only in late summer, the secret door in the chapel that creaked when opened but sang when shut just right. She began writing again small notes, thoughts, stories about girls who changed their fates by simply noticing what others didn't. One evening, while folding linens in her chamber, she found a strand of hair on the pillow beside her. His, dark, short, curled at the end. She hadn't changed the sheet since he left, and now that single thread felt like a relic, fragile proof that he had once slept beside her. that the space he left was not imagined. She held it in her palm for a moment, then tucked it into a small locket she hadn't worn since childhood. It wasn't sentimentality, it was preservation. She needed something to remind her that not all things fade without a trace. That night, as the wind brushed the shutters and the fire whispered in its low, crackling tongue, Elenor sat upright in bed and whispered his name to the shadows. Not as a plea, not as a prayer, just as a way to remember that once, in a world full of rules and silence, someone had seen her and left a piece of themselves behind. The first snow arrived earlier than expected. It drifted in slowly, like a memory, softening the sharp edges of the stone walls and blanketing the castle grounds in white silence. From her window, Elenor watched the flakes fall with the stillness of someone hoping to hear something between. Then perhaps hoofbeats, perhaps a voice. But there was only the snow. Day after day, she wrapped herself in wool and walked the quiet garden paths, now frosted and brittle. The willow tree, visible from the far edge of the orchard, stood, bare but not broken. Its branches reached skyward like open hands waiting. She visited it only once during those cold weeks. The ride was slow, the wind sharp, but the silence out there was cleaner than the one inside the castle. She dismounted, walked to the base of the tree, and traced the bark with her fingers. It held no answers, no messages carved in haste, only the truth of time growing, shedding, surviving. She closed her eyes and leaned against it. "I'm still here," she whispered. The tree didn't move, but somehow she felt heard. Back at the castle, the mood had shifted. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones. Scrolls arrived more frequently, sealed with unfamiliar crests. A visiting nobleman mentioned border unrest. Another hinted at broken treaties, but Elenor had learned to let silence speak louder than fear. She asked no questions. She only listened to the way people stopped laughing when she entered, to the way her name appeared less often in conversation. She was a symbol now, not of peace, but of pause, of something uncertain. And yet, every night, she lit a single candle beside her bed, not for prayer, not for hope, but as a way of saying, the story isn't over. She didn't know what shape the ending would take, but deep in her chest, where no politics could reach, she felt the steady rhythm of waiting, not desperate, not bitter, just quiet and real. Like snow that falls even when no one is watching. Like a love that wasn't chosen, but began to grow in the space where promises ended. Winter deepened its grip, and with it came the longest nights Elenor had ever known. The castle halls echoed differently now, footsteps felt louder, and even whispers traveled farther in the cold. Fires were kept burning longer, not just for warmth but for comfort, as if flames alone could remind the walls that life still lingered within them. Eleanor's days followed the same rhythm. Morning tea by the tall window, long walks along the inner corridors, a book at dusk, and sleep. That came late and uneasy, but on the 14th night of snow, something changed. A rider arrived, alone, covered in frost and silence. He carried no crest, or no color of any house. But the moment she saw him dismount, her heart pulled not from recognition, but from anticipation, the kind that rises before truth arrives. The messenger bowed low and handed her a scroll. No seal, no signature, just her name, written in Tristan's hand. She opened it slowly, hands trembling. The parchment held only a few lines, written plainly. No poetry, no code, just truth. "I am alive. The court has split. I was held longer than planned. I cannot return now, but I think of you every evening, and I still see you in the willow tree." That was all. But it was enough. Elenor read the note 3 times, then folded it and placed it beside the locket where his hair still slept. She didn't cry. There was no need. What she felt wasn't sorrow. It was steadiness, the strange peace of being remembered in a world that so often forgets. That evening, she sat by the fire with her feet tucked beneath a thick wool blanket. The candle flickered beside her, the same one she'd lit every night. But now, it felt different. Not a wish, but a welcome. Somewhere, he was breathing, under the same moon, thinking of her. That thought, fragile and invisible, curled around her like a second blanket. And for the first time in weeks, she slept before the fire died down, her hand resting gently over her chest where memory had become warm. The next morning brought a kind of light Elenor hadn't seen in weeks, not brighter, but clearer, as if the snow had polished the sky during the night. She rose early and dressed with care, choosing a deep blue gown that reminded her of spring. As she braided her hair by the mirror, she noticed the faintest smile forming at the corners of her mouth. Not joy, exactly, but something near it. That day, she returned to the garden, her steps soft against the frozen ground. The frost made everything sparkle, even the bare branches, and the air carried a silence so complete it felt like a song. She visited the old stone bench where she and Tristan had once sat to watch the bees. It was covered in snow now, untouched. She brushed it clear with her gloves and sat down. For a long time, she said nothing, just breathed, just listened. And then, she reached into her pocket and unfolded the note again, smoothing its creases like one might soothe a wrinkle in a beloved sleeve. Around her, the castle went on. Dinners served, scrolls delivered, lords arriving and departing with boots to loud and eyes to tired, but Elenor remained outside longer than usual that day. The cold didn't bother her, not anymore. It felt clean, honest, like the words in the letter. She began speaking aloud, softly at first, telling the wind the things she couldn't write back. How the orchard looked without leaves, how the fire still crackled the same way at night, how she had started drawing again, small sketches of the willow and its shadow in winter. I don't know where you are, she whispered, but I know what matters hasn't gone. She pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. Not to wish, not to imagine, just to be present. To feel the air, the snow, the seat beneath her, and the weight of being someone who was remembered. It wasn't everything, but it was something real. And sometimes, in the quiet spaces of the world, that was all a heart needed to keep going. That night, the fire burned slower, as if even the flames were listening. Elenor sat cold in her chair, a thick blanket draped over her shoulders, the letter resting beside a small cup of lavender tea. Outside, snowflakes drifted sideways in the wind, tapping gently against the stained glass windows like timid visitors. She didn't light the candle that night. She didn't need to. The warmth she felt now didn't come from wax or flame, but from something softer, the quiet knowing that she was not lost in someone else's past. She was part of someone's present. She looked around the room and noticed how much it had changed, not in appearance, but in meaning. The chair by the hearth was no longer just a seat. It was where she had waited. The windowsill, where frost painted thin silver lines, was where she had leaned while reading his letter by morning light. Even the old wooden floor, creaking under her steps, had carried the weight of her choosing to stay when everything inside her had wanted to flee. Dot in the corner of the room, resting against the wall, was a sketchbook she had nearly forgotten. She stood, walked over, and opened it slowly. Page after page of quiet moments, the garden at dusk, the willow tree in every season, a cup left beside a candle, a man's silhouette riding away. Her drawings weren't perfect, but they were honest. They held time the way hands hold warmth, gently, with reverence. And as she turned each page, she began to whisper stories aloud, to the walls, to herself, to the air. Not rehearsed tales, but frequent memories dressed in calm. She wasn't trying to be heard. She was remembering out loud. By the time the fire was low, she had filled half a new page. A lone figure walking toward a tree, the branches stretched wide in welcome. She set the book aside, curled beneath her blankets, and closed her eyes, not with longing, not with sorrow, but with the peace of someone who knew she was still being waited for somewhere, beneath the same stars. Spring didn't arrive all at once. It came in soft, slow hints, the melt of snow along the south-facing walls, the delicate bloom of crocus petals near the well, the sudden return of birdsong just before dawn. Elenor noticed each one like they were secret messages written just for her. She would wake to the sound of melting icicles dripping like a quiet clock outside her window. The air began to smell different, to still cold, but now layered with something fresh beneath it, something alive. She no longer sat by the fire as often. Instead, she returned to the garden paths, where patches of green picked through tired earth and where the wind no longer bit, but kissed. On one of those days, while walking the eastern path, she heard laughter, not loud, but real. Two maids were gathering early herbs and speaking in half-whispers about the changing winds and what they might bring. For a moment, Elenor paused behind a hedge, just listening, and then she smiled. She didn't feel forgotten anymore, not by Tristan, and not by herself. The waiting had softened her, but it hadn't broken her. She had become something else. In the quiet, not less, but more rooted, more attentive, more herself. There was something powerful in knowing you had endured without being rescued. And as the castle stirred back to life, banners cleaned, armor polished, messengers arriving more frequently, she moved with a steadiness that others noticed. No one asked her about him anymore. They didn't need to. Her presence alone had become an answer. She no longer needed the candle each night, nor the sketches to remember. Now, it was all inside her. The willow tree, the touch of his hand, the voice in the letter. She carried them like breath unseen, but always there. And on that first, warm night of the season, she stood by her window for a long time before bed, watching the stars appear, one by one. She whispered no names and made no wishes. She simply stood still, and knew she had become the home. Someone would one day return to .as. The days grew longer. The castle began to hum with a quiet sort of preparation, not for war, not for guests, but for something simpler. Renewal. Servants aired out heavy tapestries that had held winter's dust, and warm breezes flowed through corridors that once echoed only footsteps. Elenor joined in this gentle rhythm, not as a noble watching from a distance, but as a woman moving through the spaces that had held her silence. She swept her own chamber floor one morning, not because she had to, but because she wanted to touch the place that had carried her grief and her hope. It was a soft act, almost sacred. Her hands, once stiff from cold, now moved with ease. She opened her windows each dawn, letting in birdsong and light. She changed the linens herself, placed lavender in the corners, and rearranged the books. Beside her chair, nothing was urgent, but everything felt meaningful. Outside, the gardens began to bloom in full color. Tulips in reds and yellows, the willow now draped in young green leaves, and bees returning to the air like tiny, determined knights. Elenor began walking farther than before, past the stables, past the orchard, down the narrow trail that led to the river. One morning, she brought her sketchbook. She sat beneath a flowering tree and began to draw what she saw, not just the plants or the path, but the feeling of being there, the hush of the leaves, the way the sun danced through their veins. And as she worked, she felt something unexpected, not joy, but something gentler, forgiveness, not toward anyone in particular, but toward time itself, for taking so long, for not rushing, for allowing her to grow quietly. She smiled at her own slowness, her own unfolding. It had taken seasons to feel like herself again, not the version they married, not the one she thought she had to become, but the one who remained when everything else had been stripped away. And that version, quieter, stronger, more whole, was finally beginning to bloom that evening, as the sky shifted from soft gold to deep lavender. Elenor lit a single candle and sat by her window with a new sense of stillness. The breeze carried the scent of blooming rosemary, and the distant hum of crickets began their nightly hymn. She wasn't waiting anymore, not in the way she once had. It wasn't about Tristan returning, or letters arriving. It wasn't about proving devotion or holding on to what might never be. Something deeper had settled inside her, the understanding that she was her own season now. She had become the keeper of her own light. The love she had given wasn't lost, it had simply taken root inside her, growing into something quiet and real. And in that quiet, she found a kind of companionship no absence could steal. She didn't need answers. She didn't need promises. She needed only this moment, the sound of leaves brushing the stone, the slow flicker of the flame, the soft pulse of her breath. Her thoughts wandered to the first time she had ever heard Tristan's voice. It had been under the old tree during summer. He had spoken of stars and stories, not politics or land. He had laughed then, a real laugh, before duty wrapped its fingers around his throat. She hadn't heard that laugh since, but she held it now, not in regret, but in gratitude. Some people pass through our lives like rivers, others like rain. Tristan had been both, and now she was learning how to stand in the sunlight again, unafraid of the storm. As the candle wax melted slowly down the holder, she picked up her sketchbook and turned to a fresh page. No grand design, no plan, just a soft curve of a leaf, the outline of a hand, the shadow of a kiss. She didn't draw to remember, she drew to feel. And as the stars blinked awake above the tower, Elenor whispered, a final thought into the dark. Not all things that end are last. Some become part of us, forever breathing gently beneath the skin. The early days of summer brought with them a light that didn't just warm the skin, it softened the heart. The castle stones, once cold to the touch, now held heat from the sun, and the corridors echoed with the sound of sandals and laughter. Instead of boots and silence, Elenor found herself waking before the sun, not from restlessness, but from anticipation. She would rise, pull back the shutters, and let the golden light spill across the floor like spilled honey. Her days had become quieter, yes, but also fuller. She spent mornings tending to the garden with bare hands, her fingers touching earth like it was sacred. Each afternoon, she wrote not letters, but thoughts, sentences she folded into little pieces and tucked between the pages of her books, or left inside drawers, like messages to her future self. "You stayed," one said. "You softened," said another. The village below the castle had changed too. There were more children laughing in the fields, more elders sitting in the sun, sharing stories over figs and warm bread. The war had passed them, but it had left something behind, a hush, a reverence. And Elenor, once seen only as a noble wife, was now greeted in the market not as a figure of distance, but as someone real. They called her by name. They asked about her drawings. One girl brought her wildflowers without being asked. And sometimes, just sometimes, Elenor felt something deep and quiet open inside her, not longing, not sadness, but belonging. She wasn't waiting for someone to return anymore. She was returning to herself. That was the quiet miracle of time. How it doesn't rush healing. How it allows us to bloom when we're ready, not before. And as she passed through the castle halls, brushing her fingers against the stone, she realized they no longer felt like walls. They felt like memory, like a witness, like something that had seen her become not someone's wife, not someone's, waiting but someone whole. One morning, a traveling bard arrived at the village square. He wore a cloak stitched with patches from every region, and his voice carried a melody older than the stones beneath their feet. Children gathered first, then farmers, then merchants with flour on their sleeves. Elenor stood at the edge of the crowd, half in shadow, curious but not expecting much. But when the bard began to speak, something inside her stilled. He told stories of distant queens who disguised themselves as wanderers, of knights who traded swords for seeds, and of a woman who waited by a window not for rescue, but for the moment she remembered her name. The villagers listened as if their own lives were being told back to them, and Elenor, she listened as if her heart had been waiting for that exact note, that exact silence between words. When the bard finished, he passed his hat, bowed with a grin, and walked off before anyone could ask where he'd come from. That night, Elenor couldn't sleep, not from restlessness, but from a soft ache that curled beside her like a question. She got out of bed and walked barefoot through the corridor, her candle dancing shadows on the stone walls. In the library, where the air always smelled faintly of ink and ash, she found her old letters again. She didn't read them. She just touched them, as one might touch a relic, with reverence, with gratitude, with no desire to relive. She whispered thank you. Then she placed them all inside a box, wrapped it in cloth, and tucked it into the highest shelf, out of sight but never forgotten. Some chapters are not meant to be reopened. They are meant to be honored. And as she returned to bed, the candle flickering low, Elenor felt not the weight of the past, but the softness of having survived it. She no longer needed to be reminded of what she had lost. She needed only to remember what she had learned, that love does not always arrive in return, but it always leaves something behind the next day. Elenor awoke to the sound of birds gathering near her window, their wings catching the morning sun like tiny sails. She dressed slowly, brushing her hair with care, and chose a gown the color of sage not for any occasion, but because it felt right against her skin. As she stepped outside, the sky stretched wide and forgiving, and the air carried a warmth that lingered like a soft hand at her back. She walked without a destination, letting her feet lead her beyond the orchard, past the chapel, and toward the path by the northern ridge. From that height, she could see the river winding like silver ribbon below, and the village rooftops stacked like resting birds. She sat beneath a lone hawthorn tree and breathed. For the first time in seasons, she wasn't hoping for change. She was simply present. It was there, in that quiet stretch of land between memory and possibility, that she opened her sketchbook again. But this time, she didn't draw trees or towers or faces. She drew doors, dozens of them, each one different, some wide and inviting, others narrow and hidden, some open just a crack, others sealed tight. And under each one, she wrote a single word: choice. Not every door must be opened, she thought, but we must know they're ours to choose. She smiled at the simplicity of it. She had spent so long waiting at the wrong door, praying it would open, but peace, it seemed, was not behind a door. It was beside her the whole time, waiting for her to sit down and notice. As the sun climbed higher, casting dappled gold across her pages, Elenor closed her sketchbook and placed it in her lap. She tilted her face toward the wall, eyes closed, not thinking of Tristan, not wondering what IFS, just breathing, just being. The wind moved gently through the hawthorn branches above, and she imagined it whispering her name, not as a question, not as a memory, but as an answer. She smiled, and then, slowly, she stood ready, finally, to walk forward. By the time midsummer arrived, The castle had become something else entirely, not a monument to old titles or forgotten vows, but a living space filled with quiet rituals. Bread baked in the early hours, its scent curling down the halls. Cat lounged on the sunlit steps of the chapel. Curtains danced in open windows, and Elenor, once a ghost inside her own life, had grown into someone rooted like the old trees in the courtyard that no longer bloomed, but still stood strong. She spent her days in gentle rhythm, tending to the herb garden, organizing the old library, walking by the riverbank in bare feet. Each action was small, but full. She wasn't chasing meaning anymore. She was living it. One morning, she received a letter sealed with wax. The emblem faded and unfamiliar. Her hands didn't tremble as they once did when opening news. Inside, the message was brief. A new alliance had been formed in the neighboring kingdom. Her marriage, it seemed, had long been forgotten by those who once arranged it. There was no mention of her name, no closure, no acknowledgement, and oddly, it didn't hurt. She smiled faintly and folded the letter, tucking it beneath a stack of papers she no longer needed. Sometimes silence is the clearest answer. She walked to the window and watched the sky shift, clouds parting, light pouring through. Her past was not erased. It was simply no longer in command. Later that day, she invited the village children into the castle's garden to paint. She gave them brushes and jars of dye and let them color the stones with their dreams. Flowers bloomed beside dragons, suns rose beside imaginary castles, and as the children laughed and pointed to their masterpieces, Elenor sat on the steps, heart full in a way she hadn't known possible. Not because she had rewritten her story, but because she had stopped trying to. She had allowed it to be what it was. And now, she was writing something new, not with ink, but with presence, with kindness, with color, with choice. That evening, after the children had left and the last streaks of orange faded from the horizon, Elenor wandered into the chapel alone. The room smelled of old stone and candle wax, the air still and cool like a whispered prayer. She didn't come to ask or plead. She came to sit. She chose the third pew from the front, the one with a cracked wooden edge she used to avoid. And there, in the flickering candlelight, she closed her eyes and listened, not for a voice, not for a sign, but for the quiet that had once frightened her. Now, it comforted her. In that silence, she could hear all the versions of herself. The girl who had waited by the window, the wife who tried to be enough, the woman who wept into her pillow so no one would hear. They were all still part of her, and always would be, but she also saw who she had become. The one who got up again, the one who painted, the one who forgave, not out of weakness, but out of strength. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't about excusing the pain, it was about choosing not to carry it like armor. That night, in the chapel's silence, she forgave everyone who had spoken for her before she found her own voice. She forgave the prince who had once promised her a kingdom, but never asked if she wanted to rule. And most importantly, she forgave herself for waiting so long to love the life that was waiting right beside her. Not the one she imagined, the one that was real. As she left the chapel, the stars had already begun their quiet watch in the night sky. She paused in the courtyard, looking up, letting the cool air kiss her face. She didn't make a wish. She didn't need to. She had everything she needed: breath, choice, peace. And when she returned to her room and climbed into bed, she pulled the blanket up to her chin and smiled. Not because she had finished the story, but because she had finally begun it. The castle, once echoing with duty and expectation, now breathed with gentleness. Mood lights spilled across the floors, catching in the edges of old rugs and window frames like lace made of light. Elenor lay still, her eyes tracing the ceiling as if it too held stories of rainstorms it had heard, footsteps it had counted, and dreams it had silently cradled. She thought of the girl she used to be, the promises made for her, the choices stolen before she ever had a voice. And she thought of the woman she now was, not loud, not defiant, but steady, free, not because she had torn down the walls, but because she had grown past them, outlived them, outloved them. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a lullaby. It carried with it the scent of lavender and old wood, and the sounds of distant laughter from the village where candles still flickered in cottage windows. Somewhere down there, a mother hummed her child to sleep. A baker prepared dough for morning bread. Life went on, not with grandeur, but with grace. And Elenor, wrapped in warmth, felt part of it, not apart from it. Her story wasn't a legend carved into stone. It was a quiet truth, lived moment by moment, page by page. No prince, no crown, just her with her breath, her choices, her calm. As her eyelids grew heavier, She let herself surrender to the softness around her. The fire in the hearth crackled low. The bed beneath her creaked gently as she shifted, pulling the covers close. There was no more waiting, no more pretending. Just this moment, this night, this peace. And in the final hush before sleep claimed her, Elenor whispered to the dark what she no longer feared to say. I was enough, all along. The words weren't a declaration, they were a release, and as her breath deepened, and her thoughts slowed, the stars above turned quietly as they always had, bearing witness to a woman who no longer needed to be seen, to finally see herself.